Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our iNaturalist CSI Canadian Species Identification webinar series. This is the fourth webinar we've done this summer to help with identifying certain species groups. This one is focusing on native plants. Stay tuned for our final webinar coming up on September 27th on common birds. This webinar and others we've recorded and delivered can be found on CWF's website. The easiest way to find it is to just Google CWF webinars. I would like to begin by acknowledging with immense gratitude that the land from which the Canadian Wildlife Federation resides and where we live, work, and play is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am Caitlin Brandt, and I am the digital iNaturalist technician at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I'd like to welcome Gabby Nichols, Programs Coordinator at the Canadian Council of Invasive Species, who will be our presenter today. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping things. So if you're having problems with audio, check audio settings to be sure Zoom has access to speakers and headphones. If this doesn't work, sometimes simply leaving and rejoining will help solve the issue. Only panelists and presenters can see the chat, so please use this for any technical problems, such as you can't see the presentation or there's an audio issue. The Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen will be used to pose questions to the presenters. We'll have a question period at the end, so please ask questions throughout and we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end. CWF is one of Canada's largest conservation organizations, undertaking projects in conservation across the country. Our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife and habitats. And we do this in a number of ways. We have specific projects in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments, many of which target species at risk, like the right whale, landing turtle, at-risk bats, and the monarch butterfly, as well as through engaging the public and youth through programs like Wild Outside, the Canadian Conservation Corps, and through citizen science, like iNaturalist Canada. So the iNaturalist is managed by the Canadian Wildlife Federation in Canada, and with our partners, the Royal Ontario Museum, Parks Canada, and NatureServe Canada, we make up the iNaturalist Canada Steering Committee. Together, these all feed into the iNaturalist.org database, which is a global database run by the California Academy of Sciences in partnership with National Geographic. There are 19 countries and more coming who all have their own iNaturalist website. And altogether, we have over 100 million verifiable observations. The dataable is searchable and downloadable by anyone. A lot of this data is used by conservation organizations for research and to help conserve at-risk species. A primary reason we're encouraging people to use iNaturalist Canada is it allows data to be shared more easily with local conservation organizations. The content is also catered to show local species, and everything is bilingual on the Canadian website, and that includes all of our resources and help guides. The data can be filtered. You can look up introduced species. So you can search specifically for this. And you can see here, these are the global observations. So you might want to go down to your local area or something like that. Right now, we have over 8.8 million observations in Canada, and we're hoping to get 9 million by the end of the summer. So here you can see how you can filter for introduced species. There's a filters tab at the top right-hand corner on the website that you can use for this. So iNaturalist is for everyone. Anyone can contribute to conservation. All you need to do is take a photo. So you definitely don't need to be an expert to use iNaturalist. It's super simple to use the app. It connects to your camera phone. You snap a picture, it will automatically add the GPS and the date to help. And there's the photo image software, recognition software that you can use to narrow down species groups. It's really, really good software that will help narrow it down to, a specific type of flower. So again, don't need to be an expert to use iNaturalist. Everything helps. Anyone can contribute to science. On the website, you can drag and drop photos from your laptop or your DSLR. It's super easy to do as well, and it has all the same features. It will take the GPS from your camera and date. So there's an example of the website there. Oh, we have loads of guides to help with taking photographs of specific species groups. They can be found in the resources section of iNaturalist.ca. So we have plants, birds, there's turtles, there's arachnids, loads of different things. So please take a look. There's loads of helpful bilingual guides on the website that you can use. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Gabby to talk about the top 10 invasive plants in Canada.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'll just get my presentation set up.
Yes, I'll just stop sharing here.
Okay. Okay, and if you can just let me know that you're seeing the right screen, that'd be great.
Yeah, it looks good.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. We really thank the Canadian Wildlife Federation for having us present. This is our third webinar, as Caitlin mentioned, so we're really excited to be here and today to be talking about the top 10 invasive plants across Canada. So thanks again for everyone for tuning in as well. So as Caitlin mentioned, my name is Gabby Nichols. I'm the programs coordinator at the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. And today I'm joining you from Guelph, Ontario, which is the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe people, and more specifically, the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. So I'm really grateful to call this place home and live and work here. So I'll dive right in. So just to give a little bit of background on the Canadian Council, who we are and what we do, the Canadian Council is the national voice and hub to protect Canada from the impacts of invasive species. We were brought together first as at the National Invasive Species Forum, which was held a couple decades ago almost, where there was a recognized need for a national voice to bring together perspectives from across Canada, from each province and territory. So after that, our council was developed, and today we are steered by a 4-chamber board. So our board includes representatives from government, industry, business, Indigenous organization, as well as chapters, which I'll dive into just a little bit in a slide or two. But our main goal is collaboration being a big part of it, but collaboration with partners to deliver pathway-focused tools and resources that essentially stimulate Canadians to take action, simple actions, that help prevent the spread of invasive species across Canada. So I'll dive into a little bit of detail there as well. And just a snapshot, this is our board of directors, some of the organizations that help steer the direction of our organization. As you can see, there's quite a variety there, and maybe some organizations you're already familiar with. And I mentioned chapters, so our chapters are a really key part of how we collaborate across Canada. Essentially, a chapter is a provincial or a territorial organization that's either a nonprofit or a charitable organization, and essentially it's one chapter per province or territory across Canada. So today we have 10 active chapters, and you can see them here on the screen, that essentially we work with to meet fairly frequently, monthly, but also quarterly, for more formal meetings, to share information, resources, kind of get the scoop on what's happening in each province, but also to share resources so we're not creating the same thing over and over again. So it's been such an exciting network to be a part of, and they also contributed to the species that I'll be talking about today. So we're so grateful to be working with them, and eventually we hope to have 13 chapters to represent every province and territory across Canada. So yeah, this has been a great part of what we do, and definitely encourage everyone to check out your local chapter. If you see it there on the screen, they've got lots of great resources specific to your area. And I just wanted to provide a little background on invasive species and what they are, just so that we're all kind of on the same page, everyone sitting behind their screens. So just a simple definition is that invasive species are plants, animals, or microorganisms that have been accidentally or deliberately introduced beyond their native range. So any species can be introduced beyond its native range, but it's actually the ones that have a negative impact that are considered invasive, and they can impact either the environment, the economy, or society, which includes human health. So as you can imagine, not every invasive species hits all three of those categories, but when they do, that's when we kind of have some of our worst invasive species on our hands. So definitely keeping an eye out, and you'll notice as I go through these invasive plants today, a lot of them hit all three categories for sure. So just some facts to give us kind of an idea of how big of an issue invasive species are. Globally, invasive species are recognized as one of 5 direct drivers in biodiversity loss around the world. In Canada, it's estimated an annual cumulative loss of revenue caused by just 16 invasive species is between $13 and $35 billion. So that's per year. And invasive species damage a lot of different industries, but specifically the agriculture and forestry industries, it's estimated it's a $7.5 billion loss in revenue annually. So it's definitely on the industry economy side of things is something that we can put a number to. It's a big impact for sure, especially just talking in Canada too. And on the screen, you'll notice there's just a few examples of invasive species, some you might be familiar with. The bottom left is garlic mustard. So that's a herbaceous biannual plant that often grows sort of in the understory of thickets or forest areas, and essentially just takes over, has tiny black seeds that each plant produces hundreds of that can get stuck to the mud on the bottom of your shoes or in your pets or other animals' fur, and basically can easily spread from one trail to another, essentially. So that's a pretty nasty one. Spongy moth caterpillar, especially people in Ontario are probably pretty familiar with this one. It was formerly called gypsy moth caterpillar. But this one is really great at defoliating our deciduous trees. And just in 2021, 1.8 million hectares of trees were defoliated in just Ontario by spongy moth in 1 year. So it's quite the impact on our forests and even our urban trees and all the good things that trees do for us. So that's another great example of a bad invasive species. And then giant hogweed, which I'll dig into a little bit later, is one that we often hear about in the news. It produces a sap that essentially, once it gets on your skin and then that's exposed to sunlight or any UV ray, it can cause some pretty bad lesions that are burn-like. So definitely not a fun one and one to avoid, but just an example of that human health impact of invasive species. So I had also mentioned that our focus is collaboration through pathways of spread. So just to give a bit more detail on what I mean by pathways of spread, they're the means or routes by which invasive species are introduced. So invasive species pathways can be natural, so say wind or water transporting seeds or insects, but a lot of the time it's the human-made pathways or human affected pathways, which cause sort of the exponential spread and growth of invasive species. So you can see some bullet points of just some examples: garden horticulture trade, pet and aquarium trade, of where invasive species are spread by humans. And that's something what we focus on. Focusing on these pathways is more of a preventative approach. Once invasive species are introduced through these pathways and become established, it's so much harder and so much more expensive to get rid of them. So if we focus on prevention and kind of looking at where these species are even coming in, that's where we can do a lot of our work and hopefully prevent some pretty big damage and cost in the future as well. So just a few more facts just to make it clear how impactful invasive species are. The number of new invasions by invasive species has increased over the past 200 years, with about 40% occurring in the last 40 years. And that's just with population growth, people traveling more. We have international trade. So all of these things impact invasive species being introduced into Canada. A new invasive plant specifically is established in Canada about every 2 years. And about 58% of invasive plant species appear to have arrived in Canada through deliberate introduction. And you'll definitely notice as I go through some of these species that that's a trend. A lot of them are introduced intentionally for other purposes, and then it kind of goes wrong. So we'll definitely dive a bit more into that as we go here. But without further ado, here are the 10 top invasive species. As I mentioned, we had our chapters submit invasive species that they are either dealing with in their provinces or territories, or are kind of nervous about coming to Canada or are on their radar. So not all of these species are present in Canada at this time, or they're not widely spread. So you'll notice I've put an alert on those species to kind of watch out for in other provinces and territories, or all provinces and territories. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the other thing is there are, of course, hundreds of invasive plants in Canada. So this is definitely not an all-inclusive list. And I encourage you to check out your chapter resources and other organizations in your area for more details on that. But let's dive right in. So our first is dog-strangling vine. So people in Ontario and Quebec are probably more likely to have heard this. And then most recently in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, there's been some populations of dog-strangling vine. But it's essentially been introduced from Europe, specifically Ukraine and southwestern Russia. And it was believed to be a part of a garden. It was introduced as a sort of a new specimen and has since spread from there since the late 1800s. So it belongs to the milkweed family, and it forms a thick mat of vegetation. So it's a bit more of a vine than we notice with our native milkweed plants, but it definitely has that sort of white milky sap, which is toxic, but also in the fall creates sort of more of those fluffy seed heads, which help the seeds actually spread through the wind more easily. So those thick vines and mats that it creates in those photos, as you can see, really impacts a lot of the native vegetation, especially in managed woodlots where there's sort of been disturbed soil. We've noticed a lot of growth in those areas, and they seem to do very well. And this species happens to be really great at kind of any condition it can grow in. So understories of forests and more shady conditions, as well as sunny conditions as well. So it's one of those species that's just exceptionally good at growing and can easily outcompete our native species that way. In terms of identification, it has a woody rootstock that can grow up to 2 meters. Its leaves are opposite and smooth and green. That can be a sort of lighter green to a darker green. And when it is a dark green, it tends to have a bit of a luster to it. The flowers are very small and kind of grow in clusters of 5 to 20 flowers in June and July. And they have 5 petals per flower that tend to be a bit of a pink to maroon color, but can be in some species a purple kind of black color as well. So that's something to look for. And the fruit forms in July and August, which are those long, slender pods. So unlike milkweed pods, which are a bit more thicker and like a teardrop, these are more of a slender pod to look out for. So that's kind of a distinguishing factor. All right, giant hogweed. So I dived into this one a little bit in my example earlier, but as you can see from the picture, they can create some pretty nasty burns when that sap is on the skin and then exposed to either natural or artificial UV light. So it can be pretty painful. This species also gets very tall, as you can see, and is often confused with cow parsnip, which is a native species, but is also similar in the carrot family, and can get quite tall, but not as tall as giant hogweed. So this is another example of a species that was introduced as an ornamental species. I think somebody saw it and was like, what a big, beautiful white flower, without realizing the damage that it could cause. And then part of the reason that it spreads so well is that it produces a lot of seeds that have these sort of wings to it, so it can spread by wind, but also it tends to grow in riparian areas, so near streams, where those seeds can actually fall into the stream and remain buoyant for a few days, where it can then easily spread downstream in, say, a flooding event, or just when the seeds fall into the water. So that's something to keep in mind if you have some in your area. Yeah, so they like cool, moist environments, as I mentioned, along riverbanks, but you'll also see them in ditches, railway tracks, roadsides, really liking those sort of disturbed locations. They can grow 2 to 5 meters in height. The flowers grow on a single stem and create this sort of umbrella white umbel, so similar to Queen Anne's lace, but far bigger. And it's often, as I mentioned, confused with cow parsnip, and there are some other parsnip and carrot family species that it can be confused with as well. Some of the distinguishing factors are the jagged leaves, which are also very large. And then the stem itself has sort of a red-purple blotch on it that you won't see as significant in other similar species. So hydrilla, so I've made this one, I've noted it as an alert species. It's not actually been considered established in Canada, but it's essentially at Canada's border. So it's in the neighboring American states. So the southern states from Florida to California, along the west coast in California and Washington, and then it's essentially all along the Atlantic seaboard and inland to Pennsylvania, Indiana, Wisconsin, New York, and a few other states as well. So it's essentially right on our borders and is something we definitely want to keep an eye out for. So there also, hydrilla can be found on basically every continent except Antarctica. So it's done very well for itself in establishing in other areas. So it is a matter of time until we likely see it in Canada. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. In my past presentation, I talked about Eurasian water milfoil. It's very similar to this species. It creates these sort of thick mats on the water. It's an aquatic plant that basically prevent light from entering the water and completely alter water habitat. So this prevents like fish spawning habitat, as well as just changing the water chemistry in general. So really bad impact, as well as it can impact the movement of water through, say, irrigation canals, but also impedes our recreation abilities. As you can imagine, looking at those mats there, it wouldn't be too fun to swim in them. And when motorboats go by and any sort of piece of that plant is broken off, it can create an entirely new piece just from that one, say, broken off stem piece. So it can spread just so well and so easily. So definitely something we don't want in our rivers and waterways. So something to kind of keep an eye out for there. And just some ID, it has these thread-like roots which anchor into sediment, but as I mentioned, it can also grow into sort of a floating mat. The stems are about 1 millimeter thick to 3 to 9 millimeters long. The leaves kind of grow in whorls around the stem and are sort of pointed, 4 to 8 whorls around the, or sorry, 4 to 8 leaves around the stem. It's what to look for, with sort of a sawtooth edge. And the coloring can vary quite a bit, but it can be sort of green to translucent, yellowish to brown. And the flowers are very small and inconspicuous, but they're small and white, so you're probably not likely to identify it using the flowers, but definitely something to keep an eye out for. Japanese knotweed. So this one has been around in North America for quite a long time. It's invasive in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and it's considered a top 100 worst invasive species by the Global Invasive Species Database. So this one, again, was introduced for another purpose. So it was introduced for erosion control, but also as a forage for livestock. So it grows very, very quickly in a lot of different conditions as well. Presently, it's in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, BC, and apparently some isolated populations in Alberta and Manitoba as well. So it's very well spread throughout Canada. It's often in people's gardens, and they may not even realize that it's an invasive species there. But yeah, it's really great at taking over and outcompeting our native species. And unfortunately, its root system isn't as strong as I think it was believed to be when it was brought over. It can actually create erosion compared to some of our other species, native species that can really hold on to that soil. So Japanese knotweed is one of those species that's similar to an iceberg. You only actually see 1/3 of what's sort of above ground. Its root system is very extensive and grows quite wide. It can grow 50 centimeters wide each year. So in just 1 year, it can grow 50 centimeters. So it's, yeah, quite an extensive root system, very strong root system, known to grow through foundations of houses. And in Europe, or the UK actually, the waste is sort of considered as hazardous waste because it's just so good at growing and out competing and growing kind of in any condition. So maybe we'll get there at one point in Canada, but we're not quite there yet, but still quite an impressive plant. So it has stems that are hollow and smooth and jointed, and the above ground biomass can grow up to 8 centimeters per day, which is absolutely astounding. It grows sort of like bamboo, just sort of these long stalks that reach 1 to 3 meters in height. The leaves are oval to triangle with a pointed tip at the end. It has a distinctive zigzag pattern, sort of alternate leaves on its stem. Stems are typically a little bit sort of red in color as well, so that's something to look for. And the flowers are really pretty, which is probably why it's in a lot of people's garden. Sort of this white spray just at the base of leaves is something to look for in July to October. So like some of the other species we've mentioned, 1 centimeter piece of this stem can produce a whole new plant in just 6 days in water. So it's so important if you're getting rid of this plant to really make sure you're bagging it properly and getting rid of every piece of it, because it just grows so fast in any condition, it seems. So kudzu, this is another fast-growing, really scary fast-growing plant. So it's a semi-woody perennial climbing vine. It's in the pea family. It's native to Eastern Asia and was brought to the US in 1876, also for forage, but also for erosion control as well. So it invades open fields, forests, agricultural areas. It does best in sunny conditions, but can also survive fairly well in some shaded conditions. And it's considered the vine that ate the South, as they call it. There's some great images online I should have included here, but somebody had left a car near a kudzu vine and it actually just completely blanketed it. So that's just an example of a car, but it, as you can see, it does that. All blankets essentially the ground. It blankets all over trees, outcompeting these plants for sunlight, but also for nutrients in the soil as well. So you can imagine the impact there. So it's currently only found in Southern Ontario in one location where it's being monitored. That's the only place in Canada that it's been identified, and we're really hoping to keep it that way. So this is definitely one that we want to keep an eye out for. So just some more identifications or identification points. So the leaves are compound and alternate, and there's 3 leaflets, as you can see in the top image in the bottom right, per leaf, and they're about 7 to 25 centimeters long. So the vine is woody in appearance, but when you actually touch it, it's a bit more of a spongy feel. Apparently, when the vine is cut, there's a sort of smell of methanol. And then it can be similar and confused with hog peanut or riverbank grape, which are both native species. So that's something to consider. It grows this sort of pretty white, pink to purple flower. The seeds, it can spread by seed, but mostly through runners and rhizomes. So the seeds aren't the most viable, but definitely a part that will help you identify them. So another fast-growing vine is a mile-a-minute weed, or MAM. So this is a herbaceous annual trailing vine, and it's native to Eastern Asia and the Philippines. So it's an annual, which means that it reproduces and spreads via seed. So in the next slide, you'll see some examples of those seeds, but the seeds are exceptionally good at spreading. It was first introduced in the US in the 1930s. Apparently, some nursery stock was brought over from Japan. I believe it was holly And this plant or seeds were in that sort of mix of plants, and from there it spread. So there's another pathway of spread is through nursery garden centers. So it's, as mentioned, not yet in Canada, but this is definitely something we don't want in Canada. Currently, it's infesting the northeast and mid-Atlantic regions of the US, so neighboring provinces, that's something to keep an eye out for. Again, like kudzu and like Japanese knotweed, it grows very quickly, up to 6 inches per day, which is just exceptional. And as mentioned, it spreads through seeds. The seeds can actually remain buoyant in the water for up to 7 days. So that can help it. Essentially, the seeds fall into water after a flooding event or near, if they are growing sort of near a stream, and just can quickly spread that way. Birds and other animals also eat the seeds, which then help it to spread as well. And then another way to spread is through that contaminated nursery stock, as mentioned. So just looking at some ways to identify it, you can see the leaves are the pretty distinctive triangle. It's almost an equilateral triangle. It's even on both sides. There's not a lot of other plant species that have that sort of unbroken triangle shape. So that's definitely something to look for. The stems themselves have these little rounded barbs, which help it to grab onto anything, and they can be quite sharp too. So if you do see any, say if you're in the States, be careful if you are going to touch it. The berries themselves, or the fruit when they're produced, can be green, and then as they ripen become this sort of bluey purple that you see in the top right corner. And even the green seeds can remain viable as well. So another thing to look for is the circular sort of leaflet that you can see between nodes just below in that top left photo, I guess. That's where the fruits start to grow. So that's something to look for that's a bit more distinctive as well. So orange hawkweed, this one is very well spread throughout Canada. It's in a lot of the provinces and even in the Yukon. It's actually seen to be a bit more of an issue on the Pacific Northwest in the States and in BC and Canada. There are 14 different species of invasive hawkweed, but we'll just hit on orange hawkweed, but they all have a sort of similar look to them. And they're highly invasive, as I mentioned, in BC, just because of the conditions, the soil and sort of conditions that BC has are just work exceptionally well with this plant. They spread quickly through ground runners as well as roots and seeds. So it's a part of the Asteraceae family. So it's kind of got that bit of a sunflower look to it, or a dandelion head, you might say. And it's got that bright orange, as well as a hairy stem and compound rounded or loose clustered leaves. The stem and leaves have a milky latex if they're broken, and has a fibrous root. The plants, as mentioned, reproduce by seed, but also through their root system. So Phragmites, this one many of you are likely familiar with. This is considered Canada's worst invasive plant. Ontario, Quebec have a lot of this along their roadways, especially is where you'll see it, but essentially takes over any sort of area that has water, standing water, or any little bit of water. It's exceptionally good at creating a near monoculture crop. So essentially you can see in those photos, it's just almost all Phragmites and grows really tall, blocks out sunlight, and outcompetes native species. So roots can reach up to 30 meters, and essentially along those roots can produce stems every once in a while as well. So really great when there's, say, not water in its immediate area. It's really great at shooting out those runners so that it can get water somewhere else and spread even further. So I mentioned that this one crowds out native species, leading to biodiversity loss, especially in wetland habitat. It also makes it difficult for nesting bird species. They often can nest sort of on the outside of a Phragmites patch, but there's not a lot going on actually inside. It's pretty much like a dead zone because it's so thick. I know a lot of researchers working with Phragmites and invasive species at risk turtles have found turtles that have just gotten stuck in the Phragmites because they can't move through it. It's just so thick. So it's really unfortunate when this plant gets into wetlands because it really does just take over. It also is really great at taking up water, so it can kind of alter those water cycles and water levels within the wetland habitat. In terms of identification, there is a native Phragmites. It's not as well established, at least in Ontario and Quebec, but something to kind of look out for is the native tends to have a bit more of a greeny yellow color to the leaves, whereas the invasive is a bit more of a blue-green. The seed heads themselves are, for the native, a lot thinner, just looking kind of less smaller generally than the invasive seed heads. The seed heads for the invasive in the sort of mid to late summer are sort of a purpley red color and then turn more fluffy and brown kind of as the season goes on, as those seed heads start to dry out. But it can spread through seeds, but it's far better at spreading through its rhizome and root system. So salt cedar, so this is another one that is established in Canada. So it's found in BC, Ontario, and Quebec in scattered populations. From my understanding is that it's a bit more invasive and of a concern in BC. So it's native to Asia and was introduced in the 1800s, again, as an ornamental species for windbreaks, as well as soil stability in riparian areas. So it produces an absolutely massive amount of seeds, which germinate very well in very different conditions. It also has a deep taproot that essentially allows it to get to groundwater and take up a lot of that water. So it's very drought tolerant and is known to actually lower water levels where it's planted. So it has quite a significant impact on groundwater. So it disturbs and removes native vegetation and alters natural flooding patterns. So it is really good at replacing native cottonwood and willow stands because it can take up so much water. It's essentially just really great at competing in sort of those conditions that a lot of our native species can't actually survive in. And then it also creates conditions that make it harder for native species to survive in. So it's a really great invasive. It's good at what it does. So for identification purposes, so it very much resembles your kind of typical cedar foliage. So 0.5 to 3 millimeters long are those sort of foliage. The bark is old, or sorry, the bark has sort of a furrowed look to it. The flowers are small, pale, and pink to white and create these sort of finger-like arrangements around the stem. And the seeds are oval, flattened gray to ivory, 2 to 3 millimeters in length. And when the foliage itself dries out later in the season, it turns a sort of orangey brown color. So that's something to look for in the fall. So spotted knapweed. So this is another one that's fairly well spread in Canada. It's found in Alberta, BC, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. So again, a part of the Asteraceae family. It's a perennial that lives and flowers for several years. So really great at sort of outcompeting native species, as you can see in some of the photos. It kind of, again, just takes over. It was accidentally introduced in North America from Europe in the late 1800s and contaminated alfalfa and clover seed, which was believed to have been used and brought over in ship ballast water. So it's been present in Vancouver Island since 1893, and it's essentially just been spread across Canada through hay, movement of hay and other human activities. It's highly competitive and forms very dense colonies, as you can see from those photos. So in terms of identification, it can grow up to 1.5 meters tall, has several sort of upright branches that come out from its taproot. the leaves become smaller further up in the stem. Immature plants appear in the fall. If you look at the sort of bottom left corner, you can see that immature plant, which is has very lobed leaves. So that's something to look for. Flower heads are sort of an egg shape and are surrounded by green bracts or scale. So these bracts have a sort of spotted appearance, which is where it gets its name, spotted knapweed. So, and then when the flower does appear, it's that pink purple that we saw on the previous slide. So those are what to kind of look for. So yellow star thistle, another similar one. So this one's been found so far in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, Ontario. But so far there's not been any truly persistent populations in Canada, but that certainly doesn't mean it's not possible for their populations to sort of reach a certain level and become a big issue in Canada. It's a long-lived winter annual that spreads by seed, and it's really great at replacing important forage vegetation and reducing rangeland values. It also, if ingested by horses, may cause fatal nervous disorder, and there's no cure for that disorder when horses get it. So it's definitely, from a health side, for livestock side of things, not something that we want at all. In terms of identification, stems can grow up to 1 meter tall and form a sort of bushy looking cluster. The plant itself is sort of a grayish blue-green color, as you can see in the bottom right corner picture. It has sort of white cottony hairs along the leaves. The lower leaves are deeply lobed. The upper leaves have an entire margin and become smaller towards the top of the plant. The flowers are small and yellow clusters in a head resembling one single flower, as you can see in the top right picture. And then the sharp spines are up to 2 centimeters long. The seeds, which you can see in sort of the small bottom, second from the left photo, are tan with brown mottling and about 3 millimeters long. So that is your top 10 invasive plant species. But it's really important that it not just these species, but that we take time to identify and take pictures and report any species we see. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, you don't have to know that it's an invasive species, but we really encourage reporting of any species that you see, especially through iNaturalist. So we do have an iNaturalist project called I Spy and Identify Invasives, where we encourage any invasive species, or sorry, any plant or animal species that you find be reported, so that we can identify if it's invasive and let those on the ground know, so that we can prevent the establishment of these species and eventual out of control populations. So a few tips on how to take photos of these. I know Caitlin had mentioned some really great resources that the Canadian Wildlife Federation has on iNaturalist. So definitely check those out. But it's always important to make sure that your camera is zoomed in, but also focused. These things really help when you are reporting. And I have a couple examples. So that spotted knapweed, you can see that this knapweed's in focus, so the background's a little blurred out, which is great. And you can see that flower piece. So flowers are a great way to identify species. They're a bit more obvious than just, say, a leaf. So that always helps if you can get a flower in the picture nice and clear like that. Another way to get plants, which can certainly be tricky to take photos of, is to put something behind them. So it's very clear where you can see the small leaflets, just like in the photo on the right there. Having your hand behind it provides a really great background to make it just that much easier for us to identify when we do get the reports. And I definitely encourage you check out your local chapter that I had earlier on the slide. They have a lot of great resources on their websites for identification, but also management and what to sort of look for in your area. So definitely go and check those out. You can visit them at www.canadainvasives.ca/chapters to find out more. And I just wanted to remind everyone that it's not just reporting, but making sure to take action. So you can check out some of our take action programs there on the screen. And want to say thank you for having me, and I'll take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabby. I learned a lot in that presentation. And that we have a lot of questions. And I just wanted to say, if we don't get to all of them today, we're going to send out the answers, hopefully, in an email to everybody who registered. So look out for that as well. So the first question we have is there increased hybridization of invasives with native species, such as garlic mustard with little western bittercress? And could this help native species survive climate change?
That's a really great question. It's hard to say. I don't know too much about the bitter crest that was mentioned with garlic mustard. I've not heard of that. It doesn't mean it's not happening. But I know with, say, Phragmites, there has been seen to be some hybridization. It's not really as common as we see sometimes in the States. So it hasn't yet been a huge issue, but certainly there are a lot of species that hybridize with natives and sometimes actually become even more invasive. So I haven't actually heard a sort of positive in terms of climate change, but that might be a more positive way to look at it. But I think oftentimes when things hybridize, they tend to still kind of hold on to those invasive traits. So I would say let's not rely on that method for climate change adaptation, but a great thought for sure.
Oh, thank you so much. And other people were asking about dog-strangling vine. We had a few questions. So somebody asked, are these pollinated by monarch butterflies because they're related to milkweed or part of the milkweed family?
That's a really great question. So when I was working for the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, I remember this question coming up. I think there was concern about monarch caterpillars being on those plants. I'm not sure if it is sort of like proven, but I have heard that there is concern about that. So definitely something I can get more information on and get back to that person on.
Great, yeah, because there was a few other questions about, do they mistake it for milkweed and then end up laying their eggs on there by accident? And hopefully we can get to those.
I would love to provide more details. It's just I'm a little fuzzy on it, but I've heard information about that for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. And someone asked, how can we get control of invasive species in the wild when nurseries are allowed to sell them or are bringing them in? Is there anything being done, and what can be done to stop the sale of invasives, via government legislation?
For sure. Yeah. So it is a big issue, and a lot of governments are aware of it. It can be really hard, though, to regulate invasive species from a government side of things. It takes it's a process to get things sort of regulated, and what does that regulation mean? And then there's the sort of enforcement side of it. So it can be pretty difficult. A lot of the time, it's the nonprofits, a lot of our chapter organizations, as well as we have a national program called PlantWise, and it sort of complements Grow Me Instead programs that you might hear about in other provinces. Like Ontario has a really great one, and BC as well. But essentially, these programs promote consumers to essentially plant non-invasive or native species instead. So there's lots of great tips on how to garden and how to also dispose of plants so that they're not kind of ending up escaping from your garden or ending up in a place where they're going to create invasions in sort of your local natural area. So totally understand that there is definitely a need for the lack of sale of invasive plants in garden centers, but so far we're sort of on the education side of things and getting customers and consumers to learn and be educated when they go to the garden centers.
Great, the PlantWise program is really good.
Yeah.
There was someone asking, is there somewhere we can look to find out which species to be aware of in our province or territory that has no local chapter?
Sorry, that doesn't have a local chapter?
Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of the time, I believe if you go to, we've just changed around our website, but reportcanadainvasives.ca, We list sort of areas to report to, but a lot of the time those links for each province and territory will link to a government organization or perhaps another organization that's working on the invasive species side of things. So even if you don't have a chapter in your in your area, there's definitely likely some resources out there. So you can check it out through our website, or even just try Googling invasives for your area. That might help.
Great, thank you. Someone asked, does an invasive species ever lose the designation? This one.
That's interesting. I haven't heard of any invasive species losing its designation. Sometimes I guess I will say that when an invasive species or a species is introduced, sometimes it becomes so widespread that it's sort of, there's no point in putting resources towards it, or its impacts aren't too bad. I know in Ontario, Queen Anne's lace is an example of that. That was, or wild carrot, it's also known as. It's an introduced species, and it's kind of everywhere. You can see it basically everywhere, but at this point it's so widespread, it's just not, it's kind of just naturalized, so it's not really worth controlling. So that might be an example. Sometimes it does happen, for sure.
Thank you. There's a question here that maybe I could help with. Someone asked, when recording on iNaturalist, do you have to add any information to identify it as an invasive? So NatureServe Canada, which is one of our partners, has the conservation data centers, the CDCs, which have all the lists of species found in each province, and Atlantic Canada has its own. So at the top of the website, when you click on your observation, that's been identified all the way down to species, it will tell you if it's introduced, if it's native. So these things are already on the website, and by joining that iSpy and Identify project, you're also helping the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. Am I right, Gabby?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for the additional plug-in. Yeah, no, we definitely encourage reporting there, so thank you.
Okay. So what is the best way to get rid of damaging invasives?
Yeah, so there's definitely not a sort of one solution for all invasive species. I definitely would point you towards your local chapter or other chapters that might have resources on it. Depending on the species, a lot of them that I talked about today, I'll just say Ontario Invasive Plant Council just because that's where I'm located. They've got an exceptional resource library of best management practices that kind of give you different tools for managing invasive species. So I definitely encourage checking that out, Ontario Invasive Plant Council, if you're looking it up. But yeah, there's a lot of different methods. Sometimes it's just mechanical removal. Sometimes it's a chemical application, but you really want to make sure you do the research before you do, because sometimes mechanical, say like removing it by hand, will actually make the problem worse. So it's important to kind of understand the plant or other species that you're dealing with before you kind of tackle it. So definitely look to your chapters for more information.
Great. We have quite a few questions on that, so maybe when we send out that email, we can answer specifically for those species.
Sure, for sure. Yeah.
Someone was asking about purple loosestrife. I hope I'm saying that right, and how it was a big invasive in the past, and they're just wondering if it's still a problem, and can it be mistaken for fireweed, for example?
Oh, interesting. Good question. Yeah, so it does sometimes look like fireweed. If I did have pictures, there is quite a bit of a difference, but definitely encourage you to take a look. Again, I can send more information in a separate follow-up sort of email, but it's most often actually, from my understanding, mistaken with, there is a native loosestrife, but it's actually a yellow flower. So that's something to kind of think about too, but purple loosestrife, purple flower. So that's a good sort of identifier. But yeah, it was a big issue in the 90s, and that was kind of one of those hot invasive species that everyone was talking about, pull it out, just get rid of it. There was a biocontrol that was introduced. I believe there's a couple different ones that have been introduced, but these beetles that will actually eat the leaves and kind of help to keep the populations in check. A lot of the time though, with biocontrols, it's not sort of like it's not going to solve the whole problem, but it definitely is a tool in the toolbox. you might notice as well, I know in my area, you'll see sort of the influx of populations each year. It's sort of a boom and bust cycle with that predator-prey relationship. So sometimes, even though there is that biocontrol working out there, you'll still see a few years where the purple loosestrife is doing really well, and then in the next few years you'll kind of see it die down again. So something to keep in mind, but it's definitely still out there. It's still having negative impacts, but biocontrols are definitely helpful. So yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a question about Phragmites. Does it have any native lookalikes? And there's another question asking, does it ever have deep purple tops?
Great question. So I could scroll back in my slide here. There are some native, there's a native species. I'm not sure how well the native species is across Canada. I know it is in Ontario in sort of limited populations. Here we are. So yeah, you can see in some of these photos, I've labeled native versus invasive. So essentially, there are some sort of slight differences in the colors, but a lot of the time with the native, it's just in a smaller, it's sort of smaller stem, it's a smaller seed head, and you're also not going to see that sort of monoculture look to the patch of Phragmites that you're seeing. So when you do see a native, it's just not going to look as invasive, most likely. So it's far more likely you're going to see the invasive, but they're definitely out there. And then the other question was a purple seed head. I don't have great photos here, but it definitely does create a sort of purple, even like a reddish seed head when it's sort of a new seed in summer. And then it just sort of becomes more brown and sort of fluffy as it sort of the plant begins to die and goes towards fall and the cooler weather season. So yeah, great questions.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We have a question here. What kinds of Canadian border controls do the government have, if you know, in place to prevent boats from carrying invasive species into our lakes?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of information in terms of the US. I know a lot of our, specifically the prairie provinces, are working, I believe, with the adjacent states as well as the provinces, so like Manitoba, Saskatchewan. There is sort of inspection stations that they do have where they have dogs that help sort of sniff out invasive species, but they also inspect boats to make sure they're clean, drained, dried. So yeah, they're definitely, I don't have a ton of details on the specifics of that, but there definitely is work being done in that way.
Great, thank you. And we're almost at 1 o'clock, so I think we have time for one more question. It's a little specific, but I wondered if you knew, when you remove dog-strangling vine, is there any danger by removing it, like the giant hogweed, or is it safe to pull out yourself?
No, it should be fine to pull out yourself. I think I would just be aware of that sort of milky sap, so probably wearing gloves. But yeah, there's no sort of barbs or the sap wouldn't cause a skin reaction. I mean, I shouldn't say it wouldn't cause a skin reaction, as some people just have more sensitive skin, but would suggest wearing gloves. But it's yeah, not a concern like giant hogweed.
Great, thank you. And I guess we do have time for one more question, and maybe I can help again. It's about iNaturalist. Someone was asking how to join the project. So if you have an iNaturalist account, great. Otherwise, go to iNaturalist.ca and it's free to sign up, or download the app on your phone. It will automatically take you to the Canadian site. At the top, there should be a toolbar with the words community. So if you press on that, you can go to projects and just search for this project, and it should come up and it should have join in the top right-hand corner. Great. So I wanted to say thank you again for the awesome presentation, Gabby, and thank you everybody for coming, for the great questions. And like I said, we'll get to them all and send it out in a follow-up. So please look out for that and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.